BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Thursday, another Dahlia Thursday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Thursdays, I talk to you guys about the Black Dahlia murder, one of the most horrific crimes in American history. And in this episode, I will be continuing with the book Severed by John Gilmore, as well as sharing some announcements about the Black Dahlia case. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about the Black Dahlia. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. Firstly, I would like to give a big thank you to everyone who listened to the last two Thursday episodes that came out. One of them was on the Black Dahlia, but it was on the Zodiac Black Dahlia connection. That was a live stream that I did for the channel. And last week I just did a straight up Zodiac Killer episode in place of Dahlia Thursday. So in many ways, it felt like Dahlia Thursday was on hiatus, but I felt that these discussions were incomplete, so I wanted to return to them, most notably because I was right in the middle of the book Severed by John Gilmore, which I'll be talking about in just a second, but I also wanted to drop a couple of announcements. The first is that there is a 3-part series about the Black Dahlia available on the channel The Trading Post, giving a shout out to Fred and Noodle. Fred does a great job on The Trading Post, and he did a 3-part series on the Black Dahlia. Maybe he'll come back and make a 4th episode, but he has a lot of insightful remarks about the true crime cases that he's followed. He's also discussed Jack the Ripper, the Zodiac Killer, and D.B. Cooper, cases that I have a personal interest in, so thanks to him once again. And also, there is a new interview with Eli Frankel on the Seth Roshevsky podcast. And I learned about this because somebody told me that Seth had mentioned me on one of his live streams because he had heard my interview that I did with Darren Schaefer on the Cooper Vortex. So I decided to check out his channel, the Seth Roshevsky podcast. And yes, indeed, he has an interview out with Eli Frankel. It looks like he's doing a lot of things with the Black Dahlia on his channel, and I congratulate him on his success. His video had 170,000 views at the time of this recording, so that's great work on his part, and I look forward to going through a lot of his other material. And of course, there are multiple live streams available on the channel Larry Harnish. Larry Harnish does a monthly AMA about the Black Dahlia, and I happened to catch one that he had done earlier this year. And it's October right now, and we are approaching Halloween, but I watched the one from March of 2025 last night, and he made some very insightful statements because normally during these AMA sessions, people ask questions like, okay, we want specific details from the autopsy report. Is this true about Elizabeth Short? Is this thing in John Gilmore's book Severed accurate? People ask questions like that. But in the March 2025 AMA, he was actually talking about some of the profiling and specific aspects of the case that I find to be very valuable, and I really enjoyed his take on the subject, even though these are some horrible, horrible subject matters. Firstly, Elizabeth Short's body was cut in half. She was bisected through the second and third lumbar vertebrae. And Larry Harnish pointed out that this is an extremely rare type of murder. He even brought up some statistics and stated that even though these are all estimations and approximations, there's an upwards of 5% of murders that involve dismemberment, meaning that most likely a maximum of 5% of people who are killed have their bodies dismembered. And this is very, very important because the psychology of a killer who dismembers the victims is really quite different than the psychology of a killer who does not. And I'm telling you this because I've looked into other cases here on Black Box Online Radio, most notably Jack the Ripper, the Long Island serial killer, and the Zodiac Killer. But of course, there was another serial killer in Victorian England at the time of Jack the Ripper called the Thames Torso Killer, who dismembered the bodies of the victims. And what this represents, firstly, is that A killer who dismembers the bodies usually has two primary motives, and Larry Harnish went through all of that. It's either to conceal the identity of the victim, or it's done to destroy evidence. Now, what really was the motive of the Black Dahlia Avenger? Why was Elizabeth Short's body cut in half? Why were all of these post-mortem injuries inflicted upon her? Was it done to conceal the victim's identity, or was it done to destroy evidence? I would think absolutely it was done to destroy evidence. And Larry Harnish was mostly in agreement with that, and he made a very strong case for that. Was he trying to conceal her identity? No, not really. I don't think so, because Larry Harnish pointed out that the killer did not cut off her hands, the killer did not destroy her fingerprints, the killer did not cut off her head, things that would have been very, very relevant to hiding the victim's identity. And it almost seems like the killer wanted people to know that it was Elizabeth Short. Everything that I am seeing about the Black Dahlia murder indicates that it was personal, that this person had a very specific reason for targeting Elizabeth Short. They wanted to humiliate her. They wanted to do something in a sadistic way. But also, there could be a very strong revenge motive that is in play with the Black Dahlia murder that we simply are unfamiliar with. But I would love to know what you guys think. Do you think that it's more of hiding the victim's identity, or do you think it's about destroying evidence? And this becomes very, very relevant because we also see certain personality traits that are present with a killer who is trying to dismember victims' bodies. Again, from looking at the Thames Torso Killer and the Long Island Serial Killer, and that is neuroticism. Killers who dismember the bodies and transport them are usually higher in trait neuroticism than killers who do not, like the Zodiac Killer or maybe Jack the Ripper. They would be lower in trait neuroticism than a killer like the Long Island Serial Killer or perhaps the Thames Torso Killer. And no, I don't think the Thames Torso Killer and Jack the Ripper were the same person. So it really seems like somebody was doing this to destroy evidence. Now, how would they have done this? It could be that Elizabeth Short's body was cut in half for two specific reasons. The first was that it was easier for this person to transport. Maybe this person didn't have an accomplice, and it was easier for them to handle the body of a victim when her body had been cut in half, because Larry Harnish also pointed out on his live stream that her body would have been extremely heavy post-mortem, because when somebody is dead, it's called dead weight. It's more difficult to carry them. So that could be one reason. And also, draining the blood from the victim could have been done for convenience. Think about it this way. If somebody were put Elizabeth Short's body into a bathtub, and her body was drained of blood, there's just less blood evidence in their car, there's less blood evidence in their home. They can destroy Elizabeth Short's body and the evidence that would be traced back to them. See, that's the thing. That's really what I think this was all about. The killer did not care if Elizabeth Short was identified or not. If anything, the killer wanted Elizabeth Short to be identified. What this killer did not want was to get caught. This killer went through very specific movements and behaviors to ensure that they would not be identified. And you might be thinking, well, she might not leave that much physical evidence behind if she hadn't been cut in half, right? Well, this person wanted to scrub her body up and down with a bristle brush to destroy any chance of forensic evidence being traced back to him. And one of the ways that could have been done is by putting her in the bathtub, cutting her in half, and letting all the blood drain out, scrubbing her body clean, maybe submerging her in water. Because in John Gilmore's book, Severed, he talks about the hypothesis that Elizabeth Short could have been placed in water and she was submerged in a bathtub. And even though Larry Harnish absolutely does not like John Gilmore, he pretty much calls him a fraud, he pretty much calls the book Severed, which I'll talk to you guys about in just a second, he pretty much calls him a fraud for writing that book. but he seemed to be in agreement with that statement that he thought Elizabeth Short's body was placed in a bathtub and submerged in water. That's what threw off the time of death. That's what makes it seem like the time of death is just very peculiar, because so many people are looking at alternative explanations, which we've discussed here on Dahlia Thursday. And once again, every Thursday I talk about the Black Dahlia murder, so you can hit the like button and subscribe once again if you want to follow along with these discussions. The alternatives are that she was kept in a refrigerator for an extended period of time. The alternative is that she was kept in a freezer, or maybe she was kept in an industrial setting that was very cool. But this might be even simpler. Maybe her body was placed in a bathtub, and as far as freezing goes, I mean, it doesn't take too much imagination to think about the blocks of ice that people had available in the 1940s, the way the Iceman would come around for deliveries, and putting some blocks of ice into the water, as horrible as this sounds. But, I mean, that could be what happened. So you can let me know what you think about any of these statements here. But I think the killer had a high degree of neuroticism. I think that he didn't want to hide Elizabeth Short's identity. He wanted to hide his own identity. He dismembered her. He cut her body in half. He bisected her to destroy evidence, to destroy things that would link back to him. And also, it does add to the horrific element of the crime. It does add to the humiliation aspect of the crime. But he really wanted to enact his rage on her without having anything traced back to him. Let me know what you think in the comments section down below. And because this is October now, I would like to let you guys know that next Tuesday I will be celebrating Halloween here on Black Box Online Radio, and there will be a Halloween party episode that's coming out on October 28th. That's going to happen in place of the usual Tuesday show, but other programs such as Zodiac Monday, Ripper Wednesday, and Dahlia Thursday will come out as regularly scheduled. Now, I did 2 episodes previously where I was talking about John Gilmore's book Severed. And in this episode, I would like to continue with the next chapter of his book, and this is one that's going to tell the backstory of Elizabeth Short, because I think that it's very important for us to remember that we are not only dealing with the problem-solving aspects of the case, we are also going to be focusing on the story of the victim. And this is actually going to begin with Elizabeth Short and the relationship with her father. And I'm quoting John Gilmore. Elizabeth Short's father abandoned his car on the Charlestown Bridge in Massachusetts and seemed to vanish, to disappear. This was just after he lost his business during the Depression, and everyone said that he drowned or was in the deep cold water rushing beneath the bridge. A neighbor of Cleo Alvin Short says it wouldn't have been unusual for a man in Cleo's position to have jumped off the famous Suicide Bridge, at least during that particular time in history. Cleo, of course, is the father. Cleo had been hit with a real bad loss, and many neighbors said, like many pressures there was pressure on a man. And it was more than some men could take. Imagine the burden of living in a place where you couldn't raise the money for just plain eating unless you robbed a bank. And Cleo couldn't have done that. He was a proud working man with disaster staring him straight in the face. Okay, now this is very, very relevant to how people think in a different way, because on the Friday episodes, I talked to you guys about the Cooper Profile segment. I conclude my D.B. Cooper episodes with something called the Cooper Profile, where I talk about the psychological profiling of skyjackers. And in the 1900s, particularly in, we're talking late 50s, 60s, and 70s, there were a wave of skyjackers. There was a wave of skyjackers who were doing some very similar things to D.B. Cooper. Why would somebody skyjack a plane? Because they wanted money, and they didn't believe that they could obtain it by legal means. Well, what would somebody do in a situation in the 1930s and 40s? Rob a bank. And there's a very similar psychological mechanism that goes on with bank robbers as with skyjackers, is that they believe that they cannot obtain money And the only way that they can do this is illegally. They believe that they cannot succeed, and the only way they can get what they want is illegally. But there's also something that's very notable about Cleo Short here. People are saying that he wouldn't have done that. He wouldn't have been the type of person to rob a bank because he recognized a certain immoral nature of it. Absolutely, absolutely. Not everybody who is down on their luck is going to skyjack a plane or rob a bank or do something like a heist. I think that it takes a very particular set of personality traits to do this. And also, how about lack of bonding with the parents, lack of a strong moral compass, and somebody who is showing very, very much in a very strong indifference to the people whom he is robbing from. And I was just listening to a story about this on Radio Reddit when somebody said, scammers do not realize how much damage they cause and how much damage they create for other people in their lives. And with scammers, I think they turn a blind eye to this stuff and that they just don't want to think about it. Where somebody like a bank robber or a skyjacker like D.B. Cooper, they know exactly what they're doing and they do not care. It could be narcissism and it could be sociopathy. But I'm going to keep going with John Gilmore's book here. It would be a long time before the neighbors in Medford, Massachusetts, a few miles north of Charlestown, and the forbidding bridge, were able to figure out what happened to Cleo Short. Things hadn't always been that way. He'd returned from World War I as a skilled mechanic and opened an automotive garage in the small town of Wolfboro, New Hampshire. His wife Phoebe, pregnant with their second child, wanted more for their children than what Wolfboro had to offer. Their first daughter, Virginia, was called Ginny, and she was a talented child, and by the time the second daughter, Dorothy, was born, there was a prospering business. It was 1922, and apart from keeping house and caring for the children, Phoebe assisted Cleo with the accounts, billing, and bookkeeping. She suggested selling, and that the business was going to make a profit if they sold it, and starting a new one in Boston. Phoebe had close relatives in Medford, a city maybe 5 miles from Boston. Yes, and many of you guys will know that I'm always coming to you from West Virginia at heart, but during the pandemic years from 2020 to 2025, actually, I was flying back and forth between West Virginia and Boston, and I would spend part of the year in Boston. Medford is in the north. I used to go there about once a week, and I mean, it's to the north, and there are so many towns that just kind of intersect and all converge in the Boston metropolitan area. First, you would go through Cambridge, then Somerville, and eventually you would get to Medford, and you can get there on the Orange Line if you take the T. Muriel was the youngest and the last of Cleo and Phoebe's 5 daughters, and that she would later come to believe that if it hadn't been for raising the girls almost single-handedly, her mother might have had success in business. Well, I mean, we could have a 3-hour discussion on that, but that's for somebody else's podcast. If she didn't have to raise all those girls, the mother could have been a success in business. I'm going to let somebody else tackle that subject because no, really, it is something worthy of speculation and discussion. And if you want to talk about the 1920s and 30s, let's do it. But let's keep going with the book here. Phoebe was ambitious and not satisfied with the same things in life that seemed to content Cleo. She could see that people who owned amusement arcades and miniature golf courses were very popular then and making a lot of money. Cleo had often talked about wanting to build something, and Phoebe believed that the profits from the garage would offer the opportunity of installing miniature golf courses. Well, I mean, if somebody approached me with a business deal to open a miniature golf course, they wouldn't have to ask twice, they wouldn't have to ask 2.5 times or even thrice. Once would be enough. I'd be like, yes, absolutely, I want my own putt-putt. But Cleo believed that in turn and tried and true, and he was reluctant to change. Medford, he believed, seemed far too expensive a place to live. Rents were more affordable in Hyde Park, a working-class section of Boston, but he promised Phoebe that when things got better, when the golf course proved profitable, the family would move to Medford. Elizabeth, they called her, Betty, was born in Hyde Park, Massachusetts, and was not yet 2 years of age when the Shorts finally rented a handsome 2-story house on Sheridan Avenue in Medford. The new home had 4 bedrooms and a spacious den and sat proudly on a tree-lined street. And these are the things that you experience when you're talking about a horrific crime like the Black Dahlia murder. Why can't things just stay that way? Why can't things just work out? Why can't people just be born in Hyde Park and then they move to the beautiful 4-bedroom house in Medford? End of discussion. And they just grow up and then they live out their lives happily ever after. Why can't they do that? Because the world is a dark and cruel place, and Elizabeth Short experienced that more than almost anyone. Medford was a fair-sized city with a penchant for its historical past, colonial homes and old rum distilleries, and for the great clipper ships that had built the Mystic River and the Boston Harbor. The river ran through the city, as did the cobblestone streets, winding past a variety of neighborhoods, churches, schools, bootmakers, and ice cream parlors. The two youngest daughters were Eleonora and Muriel, and they were born in Medford, and they grew up loving the city. Like I said, why can't things just stay the same? But ultimately, there was a foreclosure of the business, and their dreams merged with thousands of others that were becoming debris washed against a beach. Why can't things be perfect? Because they're not perfect, because life isn't perfect, because life is unfair, and bad things happen. When Cleo Short's abandoned car was found in Charlestown, Medford police looked for him, and they had believed that he had jumped and the tide had pulled him down the currents. And this will become something that is really going to affect Elizabeth Short throughout the course of her, teenage life and into her young adult years, even though she was not very old when she passed away. And that is the famous story of Cleo Short, that he faked his own death, and that he wanted people to think that he had committed suicide when really he had not. Muriel was only 2. I didn't have a way of really missing him, she says, but my sisters did, especially Ginny and Betty. Nobody knew what happened. He had left Phoebe with the bad businesses, with desperate creditors whose demands she was unable to meet. He'd left her to deal with the bankruptcy, the courts, and with keeping a roof over the girl's head and food on the table. When Cleo vanished, there was food in the house for less than a week. It meant welfare and standing in long lines to go on the dole. Well, I mean, those are terrible things, but there is also a very, very important line here that says, Phoebe did it. So she seems like a very capable individual, and then that's what makes people wonder about, would she have been better off with a different person? But things are going to change for Elizabeth Short, as we're going to see in this very next section. Then Betty began to get sick. She became so ill that she missed 36 days of school and required serious medical treatment several times, says Muriel. She had asthma like me and Ginny, but sometimes she had it worse than we did. Sometimes the 3 of us would sit up all night struggling to breathe. We'd take turns sitting in the rocking chair, but when it got really bad, Mama would have to call the doctor, and he'd come in the middle of the night. They didn't understand about allergies at the time. The Shorts had 2 dogs and 2 cats. Whenever Betty was away from the house, her asthma seemed to get better, but toward the end of the spring she became so sick that she had to be put in the hospital. And this is going to affect a lot of theories that people had about Elizabeth Short. They were going to be thinking that maybe something had triggered her in the wrong way. Maybe she had just been experiencing some type of asthmatic attack and somebody had thought that she was trying to make an excuse to get away from them. But we're going to discuss those more on future episodes of Dahlia Thursday. And then the last thing that we are going to share is that the girls took turns setting the table and washing the dishes, and there was a spirit of cooperation, all trying to help out as best as they could with chores. Frequently, the 3 older girls would talk about their father, wondering what happened. Muriel remembers them whispering as though they didn't want to be overheard by Nani or Muriel. Well, I mean, that's kind of an oddly phrased sentence. Meaning, I guess that means they don't want them to be overheard by Muriel, the young sister. So my response to all of this is, it doesn't sound surprising at all that Elizabeth Short would want to get away from that. If things had gone nicely in Massachusetts, she probably would have stayed in Massachusetts and never tried to head out to California in the first place. But this is going to be the foundation of a lot of issues where she's not only going to leave Massachusetts, she's going to go to various parts of the country, and ultimately, she's going to be moving around Southern California, and she's going to be spending time with people in a way that is going to make herself very vulnerable, and she did not deserve to be murdered. Let's be very clear about that. She did not deserve to be murdered, but is going to put herself in these situations where people were going to exploit her vulnerability, and that ultimately seems like what happened. And I would like to thank everyone for listening to this week's Dahlia Thursday. Please let me know what you think about anything that was discussed here. And I wanted to do this episode because this is really the opportunity to share some things in regards to Elizabeth Short's backstory, and also to share things from the recent episodes that I had been watching about the Black Dahlia here on YouTube. And speaking of YouTube, this show is available on YouTube, but also on the podcast circuit. You can get episodes of Black Box Online Radio available anywhere you get your podcast under the names Black Box True Crime or Black Box Podcast. And you can also get the images that you see going by on the screen available at True Crime Designs on Facebook. True Crime Designs, please follow. This show comes to you Monday through Friday talking about the Zodiac Killer, the disappearance of Maura Murray, Jack the Ripper, the Black Dahlia, and D.B. Cooper. And there are also shorts and reels that are released Monday through Friday, not only on YouTube, but also on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan, and on Instagram, blackboxonlineradio. These stories mostly talk about true crime, serial killers, and what's going on in the news, but any subject under the sun or in the darkness is fair game. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnid88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. That's all from me now, and I will see you tomorrow for a new episode about D.B. Cooper. Until next time.